This might sound quaint depending on your age, but there was a time when I could hold my entire digital life in the palm of my hand. Like, literally, on a floppy disk or a CD or a thumb drive, when people still had files to store. Then the cloud came along and everything changed. I didn't have to think about where I put my stuff anymore or how much of it I had. Wherever I worked, whatever device I used, my documents were just there. And once our files moved to the cloud, so did our apps. We took this antiquated concept of files and folders and blew it all up. But when we started to sprinkle bits of our jobs and our lives across all these apps and services, we also turned knowledge into something more amorphous, more abstract, something that was harder to hold. I sometimes think about how simple things used to be. How I could use my hand-me-down laptop for days at a time without ever going online because everything I needed, all 3 of my programs and my floppy full of files, were right there on my desk. Versus today, where doing my job can sometimes feel like playing one of those arcade games, with the joystick and the claw. Doesn't matter if you know what you're looking for. You're probably not going to get it on the very first try. Or the second. Or the 5th. I know that's by design, but maybe it's time we built a better claw. I'm your host, Matthew Braga, and on today's episode of Working Smarter, we have a very special guest. Someone who knows what it's like to be able to fit your whole life onto a thumb drive, but then forgets that thumb drive at home and gets so frustrated by the experience that he builds a product and a company so that it never has to happen to him again. Drew Houston is the CEO and co-founder of Dropbox. And if you're anything like me, Dropbox was your first introduction to the cloud. But these days, the company does a lot more than just store and sync your files. Today, Dropbox is building AI-powered tools that help make people's digital lives more manageable and accessible. They make you feel like everything you need is right at your fingertips when you sit down to do your job. Like a claw that actually works. Drew and I talk about the transformative potential of AI in the workplace, the types of tasks we'll increasingly offload to our silicon brains, and how an AI-powered Dropbox can help you and your team collaborate, find focus, and spend more time on the work that matters most. That's coming up next on this episode of Working Smarter. Drew, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
This is great. So I want to start off maybe a little bit of a bigger picture question here. You've worked in the tech industry for a long time now. Kind of curious about, what about AI, especially in this kind of present moment, would you say is different from some of the other kind of like hype cycles that you've experienced in that time?
I mean, first, AI is clearly the next cycle the same way that mobile and cloud were when Dropbox started. Like those enabled Dropbox to exist in the first place. Sure. Some things are the same. So I think we see this sort of hype cycle. So we had this sort of explosive interest after ChatGPT was kind of the starting gun for the world in AI when it really kind of came into people's consciousness in a much bigger way. And then we're starting to see, on the one hand, like exuberance and like crazy 2021 type valuations and things in startups. And yet at the same time, large scale like implosions of some of these AI startups. So I think the kind of mayhem is similar, but what's different is the magnitude. And when I think about sort of the cycles that I've lived through in my lifetime, like I was born into kind of the PC era and then saw the rise of the internet when I was in middle school, high school, and then the rest after, it feels like AI would be more up there with like computing or like electricity or like the printing press or fire.
Like a fundamental kind of shift.
Like civilizational shift. And the reason why is you think about things like cloud or mobile, they certainly unlocked all kinds of new behaviors for us. And like it's hard to point to aspects of life they didn't change in some ways. But when you think about like the Industrial Revolution, for the first time we could sort of break free the limitation. Like energy was no longer limited by like your muscles or like your animal's muscles, and suddenly you could sort of conjure up energy on demand, and you were able to offload a lot of your physical heavy lifting quite literally to machines, but then also create kind of this renewable, or it became this thing that you could kind of bottle up. Energy became this thing you could bottle up, and then demand wildly increased. Like after you have things like electricity, suddenly our consumption of energy went up a lot, and then that translated to like a much better standard of living, and like all the abundance that's happened since then. And I think what's really consequential about AI is it's sort of analogous to like what you unlocked with physical energy before. Now you're like able to unlock with cognitive energy. And the promise of AI is like now for the first time we can like bottle up intelligence and sort of convert, electricity plus silicon into like cognition and reasoning. And that's a super powerful thing. And then sort of bring it more down to the concrete. It's just there's all kinds of new ways to automate a lot of our busy work and offload new kinds of work to machines. And so that same kind of unlock we saw in the physical realm, now we're going to start to see in knowledge work.
Well, and when we talk about some of that cognitive unlocking that AI will allow us to do, I mean, like what exactly is it trying to solve? Like what is the problem, I guess, with the way we work, with the way that we do our jobs that you think AI, I guess, is uniquely primed to help us fix in that area?
Well, the timing is really good for AI because one of the biggest challenge with modern work, I would argue, is cognitive overload. So just like the information coming at us, or like the number of things we need to juggle is a lot more than kind of our brains were adapted to handle. And then in a world where you not only have AI, but in the last 4 or 5 years, like we've shifted to remote and distributed work after the pandemic. And now we're working much more out of screens than out of physical offices. We're putting a lot more stress on our digital environments, and they've become very like fragmented and overwhelming places. And so I think we're all familiar with a lot of these challenges. It's really like 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's like a lot more challenging these days to get the information that you need. We know from brain science that you're most productive and most engaged when you can focus or you're in some kind of flow state, and yet you go look at what's on your laptop screen. And if you wanted to design an environment that made it impossible to focus or impossible to get into some kind of flow state or something that was like always interrupting and distracting you, what we have is just a disaster cognitively.
Totally. Well, and it's, maybe you can tell me just for a second, like there's a device that you have in front of you that seems like uniquely designed to like solve some of that stuff.
So I have a Remarkable tablet, which is sort of like an infinity notebook, like paper notebook, although it's electronic. It's like an e-ink tablet basically. Because over the years, I've it started out with paper notebooks or legal pads, and I'd kind of fill a bunch of them up a year and walk around with them anywhere, and they just kind of help me focus and stay on track. And now this is a great example of like this is sort of an augmented version of that where it doesn't run out of space, so I can have basically everything I've ever written with me, and then it's synced to the cloud, so I don't have to worry about losing it, and a number of other benefits. And something that more aligns to focus. I mean, the fact that it can't send you notifications, it's really just the screen that helps me be more present in meetings and to like use the time better.
Well, and you kind of alluded to this a minute or two ago, but where would you say that we tend to lose, I guess, the most time or the most focus when we're working today? Like what kind of things are sapping our attention and making it harder to do our jobs?
For a long time, and people have done time studies that sort of look kind of frame by frame or second by second what people are doing at work. And even several years ago, McKinsey did one of these studies, and they found that knowledge workers spend probably about 60% of their time on basic tasks like finding information, communicating with people, things like that. And only then like 40% of the time, the minority of the time on their like jobs you were hired to do. And it doesn't mean that the 60% is like totally waste, but it does feel like we've called this like work about work. It is becoming like a large and growing percentage of time where we're doing all this like coordination and these information tasks. And that was like several years ago. So I imagine those numbers or those trends have only continued and gotten more acute after COVID. But yeah, it's 1,000 paper cuts. It's like, I can't find the thing I'm looking for. And now I've got like 10 different places where my content lives, and I've got 10 different inboxes, and just the complexity has exploded, which means that the idea of having like one organized place for your stuff is further and further out of reach for people every day. And it's a bit ironic because like 20 years ago, or even before that, when I like would go visit my dad at work, like it was different. Like a lot of things were the same. Like I'd go into his office, he had a PC, he had a desk, he had a phone, but a lot of things were different in that, he got like 5 emails a day, not 500. And
oh, nice.
Right. Yeah. And he had an office with a door that could close, and you could see how every time he added a new tool, either a thing like a phone call could save a meeting, and then email saves a phone call, or a Google search saves like having to like research something, or all the time that having a spreadsheet or Excel would save. And it was very clear back in those days, like as you stacked on these tools, like how much they were all kind of new superpowers. But then between then and now, where as we went from like 10 tools to like 100 tools to like 1,000 tools, something kind of shifted where the tools went from helping us do the work to becoming the work in a lot of cases. So you think about how much time people spend in their email, and then now their Slack. There's this kind of dysfunction in the system where we're giving people, individuals, more and more powerful tools to spend like 100 other people's attention. So any one interruption or any one little friction point is not a big deal, but they stack up to become, the majority of the time we spend is, you could argue, is like friction with our tools.
It's comforting in some ways to hear that you struggle with the same problems of overload as pretty much everybody else.
Absolutely,
it's a universal problem. We've talked a little bit about some of the ways that you try to, I guess, deal with this. I mean, you have the single purpose device in front of you that you use for note taking. I mean, how are you finding focus in your day? Like, what are other things that you do, or is it a matter of using tools to help deal with the tools? What are you doing?
Well, it's a constant struggle. So I'd say I deal with it with mixed success. And honestly, this is kind of my playbook as an entrepreneur. Like, I started Dropbox because I kept forgetting my thumb drive. And now we're tackling all of these problems because as I'm just like a frustrated end user where I'm like, man, like the whole point of knowledge work is, you hire these people for their minds, and then it feels like none of us have the time or space to think. And a lot of what I do is kind of trying to adhere to productivity 101, kind of motherhood and apple pie things, like get clear about what your priorities are, be proactive about managing your calendar, making sure that your time aligns to your priorities. And then some of my favorite books, like High Output Management by Andy Grove or The Effective Executive by Peter Drucker, have really good thinking, or some of the best thinking I've ever seen about how do you be effective and have high output. And so there's a lot of concepts like not just managing your time, but think about what are high leverage activities, like what gives you a lot of output per minute and things like that. But I also found that like trying to implement those things was always an exercise left to the reader, and is often a lot of kind of rote mechanical tasks. Like, okay, I got to manually audit my calendar. I got to manually do this, manually do that, reconcile this, live out of my inbox. So what I've done over the last several years is apply automation in new ways, because I grew up as a kid programming and knew I wanted to start a company eventually. But then when I actually went from kind of startup founder to really being a CEO and managing a large team, I'm like, man, there's a lot of repetitive tasks. And I never got to do, I finished my undergrad, but didn't do like a PhD or a master's or PhD in computer science. I would have liked to, but I never really got to study machine learning. So several years ago, I started learning kind of the things you would learn in a grad level AI or machine learning class and applied statistics and things like that.
Where were you going for that? Like how are you teaching yourself those concepts?
For me, it was a lot of just tinkering and playing with things. So there's a lot of good open source libraries for machine learning and just building little toy apps to be like, all right, well, I wonder if instead of like me manually tagging my calendar or having my team do it, I wonder if I can train a classifier to do that. And then machine learning is exciting for an engineer because when you learn programming, basically the way it works is like the human figures out an algorithm and then applies it to the data. Machine learning kind of inverts that, where instead of the human writing a program, the human gives data and then basically the machine figures out the algorithm for you. So that it was just a really intellectually exciting concept. But then, yeah, a lot of toy apps. So, I use machine learning to classify my calendar, or I use machine learning to triage my emails, like which ones of these are important, which one of these needs a response, and things like tracking my screen time. So a lot of little toy apps to try to automate some of the more repetitive aspects of it. And then this was all like before pre-large language models. It was like 2016, 17, 18 kind of thing.
Right.
But there's a lot of new colors you can paint with now.
Well, I was going to say, are you still using like permutations of these apps that you built, these toys that you built?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So both all the things I described, I mean, I even have a little focus button. So in my menu bar, like next to my Dropbox icon, I can be like focus on, and then it will actually kill all my distraction generating apps. So it like closes my email, closes Slack, puts on do not disturb. It's kind of a taskmaster for me. So if I like start meandering off into, well, it also shuts down internet rabbit holes. So it's like, you can't go on Hacker News or Reddit or Twitter or things like that. It sort of blocks all that. So to create a little bit better conditions for focus. And then after large language models and after ChatGPT and AI, like now I'm doing a lot with like AI assisted writing, coding to some extent. And there's a lot of stuff where I kind of hit a wall before large language models. Like, so for example, trying to prioritize or triage your email.
Right.
Classical machine learning is really good at things that involve like numbers or structured data, but as soon as you give it like a blob of human-generated malformed text, English, before large language models, computers didn't really know what to do with that. And the whole natural language processing field was pretty primitive compared to what we have now. But then the large language model completely blew through that limitation. So now things like take this like long email that you've received and then identify what exactly is the request, when does it need to be done by, like impose some structure on this unstructured data. Like there's things like that. That's a pattern and an unlock that's super powerful. And so for sure in some of my little pet projects, figuring out if the toy apps I was making were level 1 or 2, now you can go to like level 10.
Wow.
And then now we have actually a little team in Office of the CEO that's like a little lab or a little incubator for a lot of these concepts to take sort of the toy version. Maybe it starts with the seed is the toy version that I came up with. We're really handing it off to a team to really build it out fully.
Well, and that's a really good segue because I think up until now we've been talking a little bit about sort of, ways that you are trying to find focus in your day, things that you've kind of been experimenting with and building. But what is Dropbox as the company doing? Like you kind of alluded before to, there being this shift in sort of how Dropbox is trying to tackle some of these problems.
We started by syncing your files. Along the way, as I found myself running this big organization and meetings and inboxes all the time, I was like, wait, knowledge work seems to have lost the plot a little bit. And we shifted the company's mission to design a more enlightened way of working. In the long run, we want to go to the other end of the spectrum with our company's mission. So the company spends most of its resources kind of in the middle. It's like, okay, there's a pretty big gap between file syncing and solving knowledge work, but there's a lot that we can do in the new world now that AI is coming online. So we're focused primarily on what I would describe as solving the 2024 version of the problem that we started with. So when I started Dropbox, the problem I was trying to solve was I just kept forgetting my thumb drive, or I kept having to email myself files, or all the little paper cuts back then that we experienced from not having our stuff in the cloud. And the solution back in 2007 was like, all right, well, my stuff is on files on these different devices. Let's sync up. And that was how you solve this problem of like, oh, my stuff is everywhere. Can't find it. Okay, give people one organized place for everything, access it from anywhere. And then fast forward to today, that's kind of the problem we have again. It's like, all right, well, our stuff is everywhere. Can't find it. A lot is different. We have all these new tools. And so what used to be 100 files on your desktop is now 100 tabs in your browser, right? And 100 files on your desktop. And then there have been these regressions or these steps backwards. And so on the one hand, we're adopting all these new tools because they're great. They give us new superpowers. But we are trading one set of problems for a new set of problems, which is like everything's very fragmented and fractured. And this manifests in all kinds of ways. I mean, search is probably the most obvious example where we're living in this bizarre scenario where like it's easier to search all of human knowledge with a Google search, at home, and then you go to work and you have 10 search boxes that each search 10% of your stuff.
Yep.
It's like no one would really design something like that. And actually that was much better 20 years ago. And if you want to find something, you just like search your hard drive and it's like there or it's not. So this is sort of a new problem. And then there's just a lot of stuff that, anytime you have this change as we've evolved from like physical papers on a desk to like files on a hard drive to now tabs in a browser, as we're saying, like you gain things and you lose something, and you often forget, or you sort of like relearn why those things were helpful in the first place. So in addition to search being broken, organization is broken, persistence is broken. So, when you reboot your computer, your files are still there. When you go to sleep and your papers are still on your desk. But in the browser realm, if your computer updates itself the wrong way, or more commonly you just declare tab bankruptcy, like you're clearing out your whole workspace when you close your browser. And then like you literally have to start over from scratch.
It's like that's the best choice you have.
Yeah. And and we could keep going. Like sharing has a lot of issues. So, which is strange because like there's no concept of a collection. So files have folders, songs have playlists. But when you think about, there's like not really, when you think about stuff on the web, URLs, web content, there's not really a consistent concept of like, oh, here's a set of links. Most of us have to do kind of the other workarounds, like, I have a cloud doc that links to other cloud docs, or I'll put all these things in an email. But to me, those are very reminiscent of I'll just like carry around this thumb drive, or I'll like email myself this file because then I know blah, blah, blah. But I think we'll find it very strange that there was no like sharing primitive, right?
Sure.
And that we had no concept of like persistence or organization. And like when you're working on something with other people, like if you're remodeling your house or you're getting ready for a board meeting, if you have a Google Doc and an Airtable and a 10 gig 4K video, there's no like common container that holds all those things. And so that contributes to the kinds of paper cuts. And you also take search, and then one way or another, you're ending up in a world where you can't find the information you need. Very hard to do knowledge work without the knowledge. You do dysfunctional things like, oh, I can't find it myself, so I'm going to go interrupt you and Slack you and use you as my search engine, and then be a search engine for someone else, get a Slack, get interrupted. So Dropbox is really trying to tackle a lot of the information problems, and most notably with our new product, Dropbox Dash, which does AI-powered universal search.
And can you elaborate just a little bit on like what does that mean in practice?
It takes you back to one search box for everything. So Dash connects to not just your files, but your Google Docs and your Slack and your email and your Salesforce and whatever you have. Indexes everything, identifies all the stuff you're working on, and then makes it easy to search. So that you do a search in Dash, it will search all of your apps and content, and it's like a private Google. It also takes advantage of a lot of what we're seeing with a lot of the kinds of benefits you see from things like ChatGPT, and Dash can answer a lot of the questions that ChatGPT can't. So, for example, if you ask ChatGPT, like, when does my lease expire? Or like, oh, where's that slide from last year's product launch where we talked about that thing? ChatGPT can't answer those questions because it's not personalized to you. It's not connected to your stuff. But Dropbox is, and Dash is. So by connecting to everything, we can use large language models to do not just a universal search, but get universal answers, to be able to ask personalized questions, or basically have this silicon brain that has read everything your company's ever written and be able to converse with it in natural language like ChatGPT.
I'm curious, like for people who still associate Dropbox with, cloud storage and files, and not for some of the AI-powered tools and features that you're describing right now, why is Dropbox the company that can pull this off?
Well, it's a pretty natural evolution for us. We've already helped millions of people and millions of companies or organizations with organizing their important files at work. And so it's not that much of a logical leap to go from like organizing, syncing your files to organizing all your cloud content and solving around a lot of the problems we were talking about around search, around being able to access your information, being able to organize it. Our biggest limiting factor to growth today is the fact that most people have some kind of file syncing solution. There's not like some new continent of people who haven't heard of Dropbox. And so we have a bit of a saturation problem in the business we're coming from. But if you sort of think about the market for organizing all of your stuff and things like universal search, how do you organize all your cloud content? How do you have a better environment? Literally no one has these problems solved, right? It's totally a green field up for grabs. And so the billion knowledge workers and growing have these kinds of problems. And so it's a huge opportunity and a natural evolution for Dropbox.
What about this moment in time as well? Like how did this moment in time from, the pandemic to virtual first inform your thinking about, what Dropbox should be building and who it's building for?
I think the pandemic was quite a turning point in a lot of ways. So for Dropbox and for me, first was just sort of the disorientation of like, whoa, okay, I guess we're locked down now. We're all working from home. And then also just like dealing with the incredible trauma of like, all the uncertainty and things like having family members that were either sick or at risk of being sick or getting furloughed or laid off. And so it just, first it was just like the mayhem of that. But then pretty quickly recognizing also that this is a huge opportunity, or there's a big silver lining here, like where for the first time, like our work could be decoupled from our physical location and environment. And, I don't think anybody wants to think about if the pandemic had happened 10 years before, before Zoom or before all these cloud tools, it might have been a very different and worse story. So, but I think we had already been on this transition to where like the percentage of our time at work we spent on a screen was already increasing, but then COVID kind of finished that migration to like now we primarily work out of screens than offices. And then to me, I love all the technology, but then some of my heroes are also like the management thinkers and folks who have thought about like what is the sort of fundamental nature of work? How does it change? What's the history of it? I mentioned people like Peter Drucker or like people that rethought what work is and what it could be. Everybody gets that the flexibility is great, not having to commute, all that. Those are huge benefits. importantly, once you give people that kind of flexibility, they don't want to give it back.
Yep.
But there's some problems, right? It can be kind of this very literally disembodied experience. It can be fatiguing to be on Zoom calls all day. And then one of the biggest things you lose by not being together in person is you lose all this kind of context and like peripheral awareness and information. Mm-hmm. So when you think about why did we pick Dash or why did we pick this problem, part of it connects to that issue is that, or if you're in a distributed world and you can't just like lean over the person next to you mm-hmm. and get a quick answer, suddenly you have to do all that through a screen.
Right. And
that screen was just not designed to handle, even an order of magnitude or a fraction of the stress we're putting on it. So that very basic challenge of how do I just get the basic information I need to do my job is actually harder in this distributed world. We made a very deliberate decision to be like, we're dealing with these problems too. They mostly look like problems, but they could actually be a huge opportunity because like literally all of our customers are dealing with the same things. And let's have Dropbox become this kind of lab for distributed work because no one's really doing that.
Earlier, I heard you use the phrase silicon brain, I think, when you were referring to some of these tools and just like the I guess, superpower, for lack of a better word, or ability that it kind of gives us. I mean, why does that feel like the right frame to you for thinking about these kinds of tools?
We've kind of had a silicon brain for a long time.
Yeah.
We've been offloading cognitive heavy lifting to machines for a while, starting with like writing, mm-hmm. like the fact that you can write something down in a persistent way or have language is actually like a technology mm-hmm. that we had to invent that gave us like an infinite memory and allowed you to pass things down through generations and things like that. And then, there are many of these kinds of things, but like computing was another example. Mm-hmm. Excel or your microprocessor can do a lot more calculations or computation than any human can. But basically the human brain and silicon brain have complementary strengths. Mm-hmm. Historically, like humans have been really good at like conceptual, relational, one set of things, and then computers will very reliably have like a mechanical intelligence that they will follow instructions tirelessly and do them really fast. Mm-hmm. The computer has no problem, will not complain or get tired if you give it like 1 million documents to parse or something. But historically it's been very brittle, and like the computer to a fault will do only exactly what you tell it to. Yeah. But you end up having to be very prescriptive about each step of that process. And so this AI and augmentation actually fixes a lot of those limitations where computers for the first time can have that kind of like world knowledge or conceptual understanding, or sort of can do a lot of tasks or get a lot of skills that were previously reserved to humans. So like computers can now, see and hear mm-hmm. and listen and talk and read and write natural language. Soon robots will be able to do that more in the environment. So now we have all these new ways to offload a lot of our busy work mm-hmm. to our silicon brains, and actually use our silicon brains to help our human brains focus.
Right.
So a lot of that distraction or friction that I talked about, computers have no problem with that. Mm-hmm. And they will happily, if we're able to like resegment and redesign work and build the right tools, build the right environment, we can actually have a much better division of labor.
Well, and not only that, but I think I've heard you say that it also frees us up to do more of the work that matters.
Exactly.
And I'm wondering, like, what is the work that matters to you? Like, how do you define that or think of that?
Yeah, well, I think it's, despite what we see, there's a lot of enthusiasm mm-hmm. about AI right now, for sure, justifiably so. But there's a lot of things that only humans can do mm-hmm. for the foreseeable future. Computers don't really have like soul or taste, or don't have the same kind of like creativity or the ability to synthesize information in the same way. I find it better to talk about it more as like an alien intelligence, where it's not really like better or worse. It's just sort of like different. And instead of like fixating on like, oh, here's all the ways it's going to like substitute humans or ways it isn't or never will be as good as a human. Like mm-hmm. That's true, but really it's more like, I think the useful question is like, what can it do? Mm-hmm. And like, how do we just like offload as much as possible? And I think, this augmentation concept is really powerful because think about Google Maps, right? I think that's a great positive example of what I think this is going to look like, where Google Maps has had you look at like self-driving cars, that idea first came around 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And everybody thought, in the next 10 minutes, we're all going to, no one's going to ever drive again and things like that. That turned out to be a bit off in terms of the timing. Things like Google Maps have had a much more transformational role in the driving experience than self-driving. And like, why is that? So, well, it's you have this like symbiotic positive partnership with a machine where Google Maps like will route you to your destination and recalculate all these things. And so, huge new generations of kids will live and die without the experience of like, hey, did I miss my exit? Or like, my dad would have like an atlas in the back seat of our car, and you'd have to like print out things on MapQuest. These things that just seem totally archaic. Now we don't have to really worry about navigation. A 16-year-old, who just got their driver's license can kind of out navigate a career cabbie or whatever. Humans still driving, humans still doing a lot of it's still picking the destination. Yep. But it's just made easier by the silicon brain in the Google Maps like navigation piece.
And I like the Google Maps example because it is easy to forget there was a time when we had to learn to trust these things. Like we had never seen something like this before. We needed to understand it and get comfortable using it. And now, of course, everybody uses this stuff. I've had a similar thought about AI. Like, how do you get more people to, I guess, trust and embrace AI and AI-powered tools when this is something that they haven't seen before, that there's not really a good past precedent for?
I think it'll be similar to what we saw on the internet, with the rise of the internet or computing or, the iPhone. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of like enthusiasm, right? So I think the first thing that drives adoption is like utility. Like it's just super useful. And the internet was like that. Like I remember the first time I could like basically send a postcard around the world in 100 milliseconds. Mm-hmm. Mind blowing. ChatGPT was that for a lot of people. Like suddenly here's a thing that has like a PhD in every subject, right? That not only has like all this knowledge, but then also has all these, all these useful functions. Like it can write for you there's a lot of like busy work it can help either assist or automate. And just like unexpected things. Like, being able to like generate visual memes or being able to write poetry, like write a sonnet about like whatever you want. So I think just it's done the capturing people's imagination part. But then on the flip side, there's a lot of fear, justifiably, as there was with, the internet. Oh, I'm going to put my credit card online and buy something that's insane. Or like, I'm going to get hacked and all my stuff's going to get... So we had to navigate a lot of this, even with Dropbox. We had to navigate a lot of these kinds of fears. So I think for good reason, people approach this with some apprehension. They're like, because there's very real like trust, safety, security, privacy concerns, concentration of power, bias, like all these kinds of things. And people are rightly out in front of these things more than maybe some of the last generations of tech, where people just focused on sort of the wild-eyed, futuristic piece. And then when we realize, like, oops, we let something out of the barn that we probably could have steered in a better direction. So I think, fortunately, we're learning from that. But we're going to go through that kind of process. I mean, it'll be super useful paired with, like, big new problems. Importantly, we can't really stop, you can't really stop these tidal waves, but you can kind of shape them and steer them. And that's a lot of what I spend time thinking about. Certainly for what we build at Dropbox, like, how do we steer it to be, in aggregate, a force for good?
One of the advantages of certainly AI-powered tools is freeing up time to do some of the work that matters. But of course, it's not always about work, right? I mean, it could also allow you more time to do things that matter to you in your personal life, in your personal time. And I'm wondering, what does that look like for you? Like, what are you doing for fun in your personal time with the space that some of these tools are creating for you?
Sure. Well, first, I'm a new dad. So
congratulations.
My wife, Erin, and I had our son, Charlie. He's 5 months old. He's made a couple little cameos on our all hands meetings and things like that. So that's a lot of fun. I mean, but honestly, like, I'm sort of back to being that little kid who like was programming and just in love with technology. I think like AI I'm now like coding like an 18-year-old again. And because I track my time, I was like, the last year I spent like 350 hours coding or something, which is the equivalent of like, 8 40-hour weeks, if you think about it. And some of it's like building little toy apps that I'm talking about. Like a lot of it's just playing with large language models. Like I've got like some GPUs in the cloud, and I'm always like trying out the latest models and, and sort of twisting them and bending them and seeing what they can do and not do, and kind of trying to become a bionic CEO. So, I mean, and for me, this is fun. Like I just love I think a lot of people might be like, it's not very balanced, but like I think it's good when but it's like, I really love this stuff. So
you're hands-on.
Like I'm very interested in this stuff personally. Dropbox is very interested in AI as a company. Fortunately, these things line up. Mm-hmm. And so actually it's been a lot of fun to have that kind of be integrated, like both have a lot of the intellectual side of it off hours and to be coding and sort of, like writing lots of code, but then also on the Dropbox side and like really working on how do we build the best products that really take advantage of all the new colors we're painting with.
I want to go back to something that you alluded to earlier on. You mentioned the Dropbox mission, which is designing a more enlightened way of working. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about like what would success there look like for you?
Yeah, well, I think first is I think there's a lot to do to improve, to make work, or return work to a more like engaging, and productive state, and just sort of realign the experience of work with like what's good for us cognitively and spiritually. Mm-hmm. Sort of some of this is why I say more enlightened way of working, not like more efficient way of working, more productive way of working. Like it's not just about making the treadmill go faster. Yeah. It's a lot about, fortunately, we're both most productive and most engaged, most fulfilled when we're calm, when we're able to focus, when we're doing meaningful work. We all deserve that. And in a lot of ways, we're sort of tripping ourselves up with the tools, like the last generation of tools. I think that'll look very different in the next generation of tools. And then that both helping us focus, but also freeing us up. So eliminating a lot of the busy work and having every minute be well spent. Mm-hmm. It'd be awesome if we got a future that's like much less busy than today and a lot more meaningful. And I hope that, and I think there's a lot that Dropbox can do to start to put a dent in that problem and reverse some of the trends of overload and disengagement.
Well, and to bring it back full circle, I know that we started this conversation talking about where AI kind of fits into some of the hype cycles that you've seen, over the past 20 years in tech. What are you most excited for or optimistic about in terms of where AI is going next?
Well, I think it's just so broad in its application, right? And I think these things like computing, things like the phone, they're so pervasive in our lives. And I think AI is going to be that to an even greater extent. I think this will probably be the biggest, wave of our lifetimes. Mm-hmm. So I think that's super exciting. These are the moments when you have these new eras of computing, when kind of the concrete unfreezes, suddenly anything's possible again, and then things harden up after a few years. So we're in the middle of that right now. Like nobody, like all the things we're describing around having these like smart AI copilots and like self-organizing workspaces, and we haven't even really talked that much about the more exotic, like having AI coaches and mentors and confidants. Like the AI is going to play a really weird role in our lives too. But we're prognosticating these things. They will exist. Mm-hmm. It's similar to like 99 or 98 when people are like, oh yeah, in the future you'll order groceries online, you'll listen to music online. And people are like, no, that's ridiculous. I mean, or they thought you either thought it was ridiculous and impossible, or you thought it would happen tomorrow. And in practice, the same with self-driving. It takes a while. The time constants are longer than you think. But the fact that it's like a jump ball, like it's anyone's game on all these things, is really just limited by our imagination and our resources. Partly some on purpose, but some by just luck. I think I'm hopeful that once again our board is sort of positioned in the right place on this wave, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
Drew, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Matt.
If you want to learn more about Dropbox Dash and try Dash for free, visit dash.ai. Working Smarter is brought to you by Dropbox. We make AI-powered tools that help knowledge workers get things done, no matter how or where they work. You can listen to more episodes on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also find more interviews on our website, workingsmarter.ai. This show would not be possible without the talented team at Cosmic Standard, our producers, Samaya Adams and Asia Simpson, our technical director, Jacob Winnick, and our executive producer, Eliza Smith. At Dropbox, special thanks to Benji Baptiste for production assistance, and our illustrators, Fanny Lohr and Justin Tran. Our theme song was created by Doug Stewart, and I'm your host, Matthew Braga. Thanks for listening.